everybody, and welcome to History Summarized. Cheesy name, I know, but still. I'm going to make videos about history here on the channel, and mainly Japanese history, if you could get it from the name. I have a feeling you might be interested in Japanese history too if you clicked on the video, but hope you can enjoy the video. It's gonna be about Japanese swords and how they evolved through time. I will leave a source document in the description, but I'm not an expert at all, so if you feel the need to correct me or the need to just check up or fact check it, be my guest, obviously. But let's get started, and I hope you're going to enjoy. Okay, we start off in the earliest era of Japanese swords. This era is called Jokoto, meaning ancient swords. The first Japanese swords that were on the islands were called tsurugi, and they appeared around 300 BCE during the Yayoi period. They didn't look like what you picture when you hear Japanese sword. They were straight and yeah, mostly used for stabbing, like swords were over in Korea or China at the time. They were quite short, usually around 60 to 30 centimeters or 23 to 11 inches for those using the imperial system. They were mostly made out of bronze, but sometimes also iron. Later on, they were also made mostly as ceremonial swords, like gifts, or you would donate them to a shrine. Due to the design they had in fighting, they were mostly used for stabbing, as I said before, and yeah, not at all used for slicing, for infantry combat, and not that high quality most of the time because the forging techniques were not as good as they are now or were later on in the Heian period or Nara, even the Nara period, the feudal age of Japan. They would sometimes import smiths from China and just have them live there and teach them how to make them and not let them return. So kind of just kidnapping, I guess. Later in what's called the Kofun period, around 200 and 250 to 552 current era, a new type of sword was introduced. This sword was called chokuto, which means straight sword. Chokuto has somewhat of a resemblance to both the tsurugi and the type of sword we see later on. Due to the sword being single-edged but still straight, it was ideal for infantry tactics, but now could also be used better than the tsurugi from horseback. It was used for hacking and thrusting, but relied a little more on hacking. Yeah, they were much longer than the tsurugi, usually around 45 to 95 centimeters or 18 to 45 inches. The chokuto also looks a little bit like the Chinese handao, which saw the same use, but also a little more from cavalry, which was very prominent in the Han Dynasty. Then they were used all the way up to the Heian period, the late 700s. Also around the same time, another type of sword seemed to become popular among the warriors of Yamato, as the Japanese were called at the time. The sword was called the warabiteto, the one that appeared, or sometimes wanto. It initially emerged as a weapon used by the Emishi, who were the ancestors of the Ainu today, but the Japanese at the time viewed them as little more than barbarians living in small dirty huts. They had a very different culture than the Japanese people. The warabiteto, having a curved blade and a stronger back to support it, It would have been much better suited for warfare from horseback than Chokto or a Tsurugi. One of the reasons that was the Emishi specifically that developed this type of sword could be due to their military culture, mostly revolving around horseback archers, compared to the Japanese military was mostly infantry and overall heavily inspired by the Chinese. Moving on through the Nara period and onto the Heian period, starting around late 700s, a new type of sword begins to appear, marking the Koto or Old Swords era, the Tachi. There is heavy debate on whether or not the Tachi evolved from the Warepiteto or the Chokto, but I personally believe it might be a mix of the both. There's actually a myth surrounding the invention of the Tachi. I'm going to tell you the story here, but I will leave a timestamp if you want to just skip through. The myth is called The Legend of Amakuni, a swordsmith, and it goes as such. Amakuni Yasutsuna was a swordsmith that lived in Yamato province and was employed by the emperor to make swords for his warriors. One day, Amakuni and his son Amakura were in the front of their store when the emperor returned with his troops. Usually he would greet the blacksmith and his son, but this time he did not, and he didn't even look at them. Amakuni observed the warriors and saw that many of the swords were damaged or even broken. The father and the son both examined the swords to find out what was wrong. They concluded that the swords lacked shock resistance due to mediocre forging work. Amakuni then vowed to make a sword that was strong enough to not break. The two men locked themselves in the forge and prayed to Kami, Shinto deities, for 7 days and nights. At the end of this, they gathered the best iron ore possible and made steel of it. Then they began working. After a month, they were exhausted from working tirelessly. They had created a sword with a curved single-edged blade. Until then, swords were mainly straight and tended to be shorter. Other blacksmiths, seeing this, were very skeptical at first and considered them crazy. But that didn't stop Amakuni from polishing and sharpening his blade. Over the following months, Amakuni and his son continued to forge more of these blades, and as a new war started the following spring, when the warriors returned once again, Amakuni and his son saw that this time the blades were all intact. This time the emperor stopped, smiled at the two men, and praised Amakuni and his son for the fine craftsmanship. It was a great joy for Amakuni, and he regained his joy for life. Now, whether or not this legend is true, it certainly is a good story. It also seems to carry some valuable lessons in there. See if you can find something and post your interpretation of it down in the comments. The Tachi is the first sword of the group of Japanese swords called Nihonto. It looks like what would come to mind when thinking of a Japanese sword. The Tachi has a long curved single-edged blade, usually around 80 to 70 centimeters or around 35 to 27 inches. Another new thing about the Tachi, outside of the obvious new look, was the way it was composed. While previous swords were usually made out of a single slab of iron or steel that was hammered many times, though Tachi were also sometimes made this way, a new way of making these swords emerged. A way that would make it not so hard and brittle that it would break on impact, but also not so soft that it would chip and bend. The way they did this was they made a core of soft steel with low carbon content, and then they would wrap an outside of harder steel around, or make the part that was used for cutting out of high carbon content steel. The way you make steel harder by hammering it and folding it, and as a result getting the impurities out. The less impurities, the harder the steel, the more impurities, the softer the steel becomes. So instead of finding a balance, he took the best of both worlds and make an incredibly durable sword of the mix. Another of the reasons for the curved blade outside of just a stronger sword is due to a change in the military tactics used by the Japanese, where they relied more on professional mounted archers rather than the earlier peasant conscript infantry. to a change in the imperial government's very old system of running things called the Ritsuryo. It was largely inspired by the Chinese style of government, but it had been very ineffective and had never really worked as hoped. It was very taxing on the common people and demanded that they paid heavy taxes and also served in the military at the same time. And they were very unhappy, the peasants. But after the abolition of the old system and the creation of something called the stalwart youths system, where sons of noblemen or rich farmers that had been trained since childhood in the arts of war were hired as professional soldiers, instead called samurai. Also, at the same time as the tachi, there came many variants of the same type of sword. There were very small ones like tanto that they were basically just knives. Then there were the giant odachi or nodachi swords that were very popular during the 1300s, but then fell out of style. There were also the kodachi, which were just a smaller version of the tachi that were used as a sidearm to the sidearm. The tachi would usually be worn in combination with the tanto, but the kodachi was also a popular choice as a backup to the sidearm. Though the tachi would be used as a weapon all the way up to the Sengoku Jidai, also known as the Warring States period of Japan, during the late 1500s, it began to evolve, which marked the beginning of Shinto, the new swords era. Not to be confused with the religion. Around the late Muromachi period, circa 1467 to 1573, we begin to get the first katana. There are probably more than a few reasons for the change, although be it subtle this time. As the face of warfare changed in Japan after the Mongol invasions, which opened the eyes of the Japanese to the inefficiency of their tactics against an opponent that came from the outside. Due to this, there came a change in both the tactics and the weapons used. While warfare was still often fought from horseback, there came more of a focus on infantry and shock cavalry than before, and therefore new needs arose for the weapons that were being made. Another factor was that there was more castle warfare going on due to more castles being built at the time, and castle warfare is for the most time cramped, bloody, and claustrophobic, and there was no longer a need for long blades made for cutting in large motions out on an open battlefield from horseback. As a result, swords became shorter and thus more efficient in close quarter combat. But let's look at a few of the key differences between the tachi and the katana. Tachi tends to be longer and have more of a pronounced curve towards the hilt, whereas the katana tends to be a little bit shorter and has the curve more upwards on the blade. From here on, won't be much change in the swords themselves, but rather in the design, accessories, and quality. Moving through the Sengoku Jidai and towards the Edo period, which was largely peaceful, we start to see that the swords are becoming a little shorter and less curved. This was most likely due to the reason that there were no longer any wars to be fought, and due to them not being used much, the quality dropped. Maybe other than cutting an unarmored peasant in half for looking wrong at a samurai. But it was also here that wearing the daisho became customary among samurai. Both the quality and the length of the katana was at a low after the initial start of the Edo period due to the lower demand and standards. But wealthy samurai, however, were able to commission high quality blades with elaborate designs. During the 1700s, a new interest in the sword arose, and artisans began working harder and creating higher quality and more functional blades. This marks the beginning of the Shin-Shinto era of swords. Shin-Shinto meaning new swords. These swords were mostly simple but still aesthetic. But sadly, not just everyone could own a sword. Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu made efforts to confiscate swords from commoners and restrict them to the samurai. But as you can imagine, not everyone did so. Only in the Meiji period, after the tragic fall of the samurai class, that swords became fully illegal due to them representing the warriors that had caused so much trouble during the whole history of Japan. At the end of the long-lived Tokugawa shogunate, and after the restoration of power to the imperial throne during the Meiji Restoration, the warrior class of the samurai was at long last abolished, and as a result, the Japanese sword from then on was considered more a piece of art than a battlefield weapon. The sword produced during this era falls under the category of Gendaito, meaning modern swords. Even though swords were no longer useful as a weapon for the military, it was still carried by officers of the army and navy as a sign of their rank. These swords were most of the time factory made and was made of foundry steel rather than tamahagani, which was the type of steel used to make swords all the way back to koto swords. Many of these swords were even in the same style as Western military sabers at the time, but after the Sino-Japanese and the Russo-Japanese wars, there came a huge surge of new appreciation for the traditional style of swords, due to the rise of extreme nationalism and militarism in Japan at the time. This leads us up to the World Wars, where the swords were used more as an execution tool for POWs and civilians than anything else. They were still made low quality but served as a symbol for national spirit, kokutai, and loyalty to the emperor. There wasn't much change in the swords until the end of World War II, where laws were made against the production of swords due to what they stood for. This brings us up to recent times where, luckily later on, laws were changed so that swordsmiths could continue making swords, but they would this time be classified as art rather than actual weapons. This time around, there are a few swordsmiths holding up the age-old tradition of creating nihonto, and we have to do our utmost best as history enthusiasts to keep in our hearts and minds the long legacy of fine craftsmanship that are Japanese swords. If you like this sort of content, I can recommend another couple of YouTubers that like reviewing history and the shogunate and infamy that have inspired me, and I genuinely think you will enjoy watching. If you have stuck around all the way to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching this video and have an amazing day.